Thank you for joining us, Leandro. Thank you for joining us, everybody, on today's On Think Tanks webinar. The series of webinar, we try to present new research, new ideas, best practice from practitioners, from scholars, from funders, from people in the world of think tanks. These webinars are recorded and then will be shared with anybody who wants to watch and listen over them later on. Today we have Leandro Echt, who's a research associate with us on think tanks and who's been working in the world of think tanks for a very long time. Leandro has done completed a recent study which has come out as a working paper on political party think tanks or partisan think tanks, which is something that many think tanks around the world struggle with. What is the boundary between having an ideological coincidence with political parties and being a think tank of a political party. And this is certainly a concern for many funders who'd like to engage with more think tanks, but are afraid sometimes of this distinction. So Leandro hopefully will help us understand political party think tanks using examples from Argentina and Mexico, I think. If I'm correct.
Just Argentina this time.
Argentina. But I think are perfectly relevant to other parts of the world. So without further ado, Leandro will give a short presentation and then that will be followed up by some questions. For those who are online right now, if you want to ask a question, I ask you to please do it using the chat box. So just ask the question in the chat box and I will pick it up and pass it on to Leandro when he's done with his presentation. So Leandro, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kike. Just let me share my screen because I have a presentation. Yeah?
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes,
okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Again, thanks, Kike. Thanks on think tanks for the opportunity to share the study as part of the working paper series, but also sharing some of the main findings in this webinar. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. Let me just start by explaining why I was interested in this topic. As Kike said, I've been working with think tanks for many years, almost 12, 13 years now, and at different points in time, talking with different people related to the think tank work, I heard this idea that our political parties will do better if they will worry about having any type of source of ideas, information for policy design, policy implementation. And that idea kept being in my head for several years until I decided to approach this issue through more systematic study of these experiences of partisan think tanks. But however, when I decided to approach this topic, what I found was that there are very few experiences that I could identify of think tanks that actually work closely or with direct collaborative strategies with political parties. And because they were just a very few experiences, it was difficult to find any kind of documentation or systematization about these experiences. So typically the think tank literature focus much more on what we can define as external think tanks, which is independent think tanks, despite some efforts like one conducted by think tanks, for instance, in collaboration with other organizations, like around 10 years ago, which actually studied how think tanks related to political parties, but not in all the cases, those relationships were not didn't imply explicit affiliation. It was more like a regular collaboration, even if you were an external think tank. So with this idea in mind, I decided to approach this topic after this diagnostic. At the same time, in Argentina, it was around 2013, 2014, and there was a political party, the Republican proposal, it's the name in English, Propuesta Republicana in Spanish. This was like a relatively new party, which a new approach to politics, at least that was, they were emphasizing to differentiate with what they understand as the old politics. And one of the things that this party brought as a novelty was that they have a think tank, a partisan think tank, a source of ideas that they constantly refer in the public sphere, in the news, in the TV. So by those years, this organization was outstanding from other political foundations because it was very consolidated, very active, very productive, while the rule in Argentina and in many countries in Latin America is that political foundations are actually spaces that do not present a lot of activity, are mainly declarative, and doesn't actually contribute with ideas to their party. So I thought it was a good opportunity to explore that experience further. So first, what I tried to do was to understand the main attributes of this category of think tanks. Usually, when the literature addresses this stakeholder, it does it as a type of the think tank category. So not as an independent category to study. So I did some research, and by picking different features that different authors highlight, I tried to come up with a definition of partisan think tanks, which is the one that I'm sharing in this slide, that basically help us distinguish them from what we can understand as independent or autonomous think tanks. So, of course, they have the generation of ideas, or the technical advice function at the core of the definition, because that's what make them a think tank. But at the same time, what makes them partisan is their explicit adherence to a political force, the way in which they direct the research, their knowledge production efforts to a specific political interest, and also the type of collaborative strategies that they have with think tanks, which are more direct, implies having specific spaces to discuss directly with political leaders, which makes them a little bit different from external think tanks, or at least that was the idea. Then, through the case study, we can discuss to what extent are they different type of organization, what makes them different, what not. So at the same time, in order to study this more systematically, this type of experiences, because they were like kind of absent in the literature, I tried to come up to understand what were the main dimensions that I would need to look at when studying partisan think tanks. So through an exhaustive literature review, but also in conversations with think tanks experts, I found that there were four main dimensions that I could look at to understand the evolution of the partisan think tank and its relationship with the political party. So first, it's important to look at the party system, what are their characteristics, and within it, I mainly focus on the institutionalization of the system, the competition, and this concept of the political knowledge regimes, which help us understand what's the relationship between research or knowledge and policy decisions in a certain context. Then, of course, I look at the functions of the think tank and try to understand how this think tank will contribute to the party. And I use the functions that Moresi and Bomaro, which are two Argentinian researchers, identified for the relationship between expert knowledge and politics. And they say knowledge plays these three functions: instrumental, symbolic, and networking. At the same time, one important thing to look at when you study partisan think tanks is the level of autonomy they have, and to what extent it needs to be understood in the same way that we understand autonomy when we talk about external think tanks, because they have an explicit adherence to a political party, and how that affects how the political agenda affects the think tank agenda. To what extent the organization can be autonomous, completely autonomous of the political party. On the other hand, a major thing for partisan think tanks or political foundations are its sustainability. And within this dimension, one needs to look at the impact that elections have. Elections are a critical milestone for this type of organization. They define much of their future and the usefulness of their work. So let me just go straight to some of the main findings within its dimensions. So as I said, by 2014, there was an experience of partisan think tank in Argentina that outstanded from other ones. It was the Pensar Foundation, Fundación Pensar in Spanish. Pensar means think in Spanish. So the pro-party, this left-wing or pro-market party, decided to create this organization back almost 10 years ago, after a major crisis, political and economic crisis, that took place in Argentina in 2001. So actually, that crisis that took place in 2001 affected the party system and created a sort of extended weakness of the party system, with the main representations exploded by then. There were no clear representations and affinities between political forces and the citizenship. So there was, by those days, there was a mass of intellectuals that were looking for a political parties that could represent their pro-market ideas. Their diagnostic was that there was a lack of force that was actually taking care of those pro-market ideas. So by those days, this group of people, of intellectuals, created this type of group. By those days, it was not a formal organization. Little by little, as the career of the main leader of the party, which is Mauricio Macri, the current president of Argentina, as his career was starting to build up, they thought that this party, this new party, could represent these pro-market ideas very well. So even if Pensar, born in a fragmented party system, its consolidation came a couple of years later in a context of polarization. So this is this finding kind of contradict most of the literature that says that partisan think tanks have more chances to emerge if we are in a very institutionalized context. Actually, if, for instance, if you can identify two main parties, if we are in a bipartisan context, you have more chances that these organizations will have an organization that provides them with ideas. But that was different in the case in Argentina, in the case of Argentina. Because part of the explanation to the origins of Pensar in this fragmented context is that from the very beginning, this right-wing party showed a lot of affinity with external think tanks and non-profit. So a lot of their main leaders had an experience in non-profit, some of the more prominent think tanks in the country, and that kind of start to shape the idea of having their own think tank. But also, if we look at the impact of the party system, we can consider that Argentina in the last decade became a very polarized country, and that has a direct effect in the functions that the think tank can perform. So, for instance, in my interviews, members of the think tank would tell me that they were mainly focused on designing the future government plans rather than, for instance, working with their parliaments, because the level of polarization in the country didn't allow for an actual debate in the Congress. So this is a little bit of the impact that the party system can have in the emergence and the type of work that the think tank can conduct. I just want to emphasize that by those days, when I started my research, the pro-party was governing in the city of Buenos Aires, which is the capital of the country and one of the more important districts, but didn't have any other member in power in any other of the 23 provinces in the country, not even at the national level. Actually, the importance of Pensar Foundation was to help the country achieve the president. That's was one of the main functions. That was actually their main work, to contribute to with ideas. So at the time of if the party was victorious in the elections of 2015, the party would have ideas to implement. So if we look at the functions of the think tanks in relationship to the political party, and we try to categorize them around these three main functions: instrumental, symbolic, and networking, we will see that Pensar Foundation carried out a variety of functions. As I said, a main one was the design of future government plans. This was very important because, as I said, Pensar lacked, the pro-party lacked of national experience, and the diagnosis was that when they got to power in the city of Buenos Aires, it took some time to them to understand actually the dynamic of the state. They, as a novel force, political force, whose leaders came mainly from the private sector field, they didn't have enough experience in the state, how the state worked, how the government worked. So they really wanted to be ahead of those challenges and have actual ideas to implement once in power. So that was one of the main things that Pensar would contribute to design the future government plans if they won the presidency. And that was interesting because as a partisan think tank, the members of Pensar Foundation could work directly with the main political leaders. So, for instance, the plans related to education policy will be guided by the Ministry of Education in the city of Buenos Aires, or the main education references within the party. So that direct collaboration with political leaders is something that partisan think tanks have, but it's not so common for external think tanks. At the same time, those plans try to mirror the national agenda, the way in which the government was organized, the different agencies, the different ministries. So at the time of being in power, they would have more ideas to implement. One important function was to provide inputs for the members of parliament, but as I said, then the polarized context affected that function a lot, because it kind of lost relevance, and they decided to focus more on thinking about the future government. At the same time, in terms of being instrumental to the party, the think tank provided inputs, data, numbers to the national and the provincial candidates in the context of elections. On the other hand, the think tank, and this is pretty much applies to different partisan think tanks. These organizations play a symbolic function. In the case of this party, the Pro Party in Argentina, it was very clear. Most of the political leaders would take advantage of opportunities in the media to highlight the capacity of the teams of Pro. If they go to the power, they will make reference to Pensar as a very rare organization in the political context in Argentina, as thinking ahead, planning, and coming up with plans that would have 4 years of development by the time of if the Pro got to power. And that comes hand by hand with the idea of the new politics that this party wanted to represent. One of the main discourse to differentiate with other political forces was that they represent the new politics, politics that emphasize the long-term vision, the managerial approach, more focus on building consensus, building dialogue, and based on expertise, versus what they would say are the old politics, or were the old politics that is short-term, hierarchical, more ideological. So actually, this symbolic function was very important to represent the values that the party wanted to bring in the political debate. Also, in terms of the symbolic functions, they would use Pensar, the party would use Pensar as a space to gather other stakeholders, to create this feeling of consensus and dialogue, pretty much what Bayer and Babkins, with other Canadian authors, say that think tanks are sounding boards. So they give us a possibility to different stakeholders and to the party itself to discuss ideas a little far away from the short-term agenda of politics. Finally, when it comes to the networking function, the think tank, because the party was trying to grow and get into the different territories in the different provinces, the Pensar Foundation played a key role in building this political institutional linkage by sending experts to the provinces and talk about different policy issues, having meetings with the main stakeholders of the different territories. and they, in a way, they also, as a networking function, they allow different knowledge experts who wanted to get involved in politics to actually have a space to think about these policy ideas without being contaminated in a way with the political discussion going around. So that safe space for technical discussion was a very important function for this partisan think tank. Finally, another important function of these organizations is that because in most of the cases they are registered as non-profits or foundations, it allowed the party to channel some private sector support indirectly to politics. It allows to hire and recruit members, pay them, and in that way, it's a kind of contribution to the party itself. Many members of the private sector will feel more confident by contributing to a political foundation than directly to the party. So at this point, you might be asking yourself what happened with the research function of the think tank, because it's one of its main distinctive characteristics. So the experience of Pensar Foundation confirms some of the hypotheses related to the research function in partisan think tanks, which state that this organization, this political foundation of partisan think tanks, has a very broad description of functions. And research is always, in most of the cases, is more declarative function, and it's actually very minor in practice. Other forms of support to the party, like I said, the dialogue function, the networking function, the symbolic functions have a more important role, and the capacity of the think tank to actually conduct research very much depends on the context and the needs of the politicians. So one of the main findings is that the partisan think tanks work more as knowledge brokers, like hiring consultants and hiring universities, external think tanks, to provide the research rather than actually producing their own research. In terms of autonomy, the main question here was that if it's relevant to ask or to look at autonomy in partisan think tanks in the same way we understand it for external think tanks. And what happened with these organizations is that in order to succeed and being accepted by the political leaders, they need to prioritize politics. So they need to lower the profile when they need to do it. In practice, for Pensar, that means sometimes removing some of the policy studies or policy risks they have in their website because they said things that could affect the performance of the party in the political campaign. It means that in practice, the think tank has a very limited capacity to develop an independent agenda. Actually, the agenda of the think tank would be the agenda of the party. And the case study suggests that there is a constant tension between being an organizational resource for the party and actually being an actor that has capacity to define its own objectives. And these tensions need to be managed strategically by the think tanks, considering the different contexts. So, for instance, in elections, their capacity to be autonomous would be very, very limited, and everything will need to contribute to the political goals of the party. Finally, in terms of sustainability, because of, in the case of Pensar, the foundation was created or mainly to win the elections. This, as I said, creates a displacement of functions where in the moment of electoral campaigns, everything will need to be directed to that specific goal. What happened in the end was that when finally the party won elections in 2015 with a big contribution of the think tank, many of the members of the think tank moved to the government, and actually the organization lowered the level of activity, kind of disappeared for 4 years until the new electoral campaign started last year. So that confirms this constitutive uncertainty of the partisan think tanks of the political foundation that had to do with in a scenario of victory or defeat. In either case, their functions will be very much affected. I think we are almost on time. I just wanted to recap the main success factors of this think tank as a successful experience, because it was stand for almost 15 years. Then when the party in the government, it saw their functions being very, very limited, because all the resources were put in management in the government. But what can be highlighted as important success factor is the support of the leader, the direct access to the leader, the fact that the think tank figure responded to this idea of the new politics. Actually, it was very important for the party to give Pensar its own identity, differentiating them with other spaces that will focus, for instance, on recruiting members from the private sector or more political spaces. This organization was devoted to provide technical advice and try to come up with policy ideas. Finally, it was very important for the partisan think tank to develop a kind of partisan discipline and an understanding of politics, which some external think tanks also struggle with. Understand that what are the political needs was very important for Pensar Foundation. So I think I will stop here, and then maybe I can finalize with some research, some ideas for future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Leandro. Thank you. That was very interesting. So just to clarify, because I was looking for Pensar online as you were writing, and they're not active anymore, right?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. Their website is not active anymore, but they are very active in social media, and they actually, in this new electoral campaign, I don't know if you probably are not aware, not Kike, but other colleagues. We are having elections in the next 2 weeks, I guess, in Argentina. So they are very focused on building their power in the territories. Yes, that's something that at some point they decided to shut down the website. I think that has to do with this idea of trying, so nobody will get there and find some information that will be used to attack the ideas of the party. But they are active in other ways.
Okay, so I have a few questions, and then I'll introduce anybody else who wants to ask a question. And Apurna, I think you've asked the question, but I think it'll come up in the conversation. The first question I had is, are partisan think tanks legal? So my guess is that they're set up as a not-for-profit organization, or a foundation in this case. So is it legal? And I guess it depends on the country, but is it legal, broadly speaking? Is this something common? that an organization kind of works for a political party?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, Sal. Actually, the legal framework is something that I didn't have a chance to explore further. In the case of Argentina, it's not common. There's actually a vacuum of, there's no guidance about if a party can have its own organization. What happened in practice is that all or most of the parties have a kind of organization that not all of them deploy the same functions. Some of them are more focused on, building the capacity of their members, like more a training organization. But anyway, in the case, at least the case of Argentina, that's not regulated. I understand it's different in other countries. So, for instance, you know that in Germany there is a more direct collaboration, which the main political parties would have their own political foundations, but actually, and there is much more clear affiliation. But I am not aware of the legal frameworks. I think, as I said, as you say, it depends on the different countries. I don't know if the colleagues that are here now have a sense of how does it work in their own countries.
Yes, I think in some cases not-for-profits are not allowed to work with a single party, but they would be allowed to work with any or all parties, I guess. You mentioned that the role of research was minor in practice, but did it still have the effect of increasing the use of evidence by the party?
Well, that's a very very good question, and that's one of the things that I wasn't able to study because a good scenario to study the impact of how actually those inputs were used was with the party in the government. But I would say yes, during the years in which the party was the opposition and Pensar was actually very active, they will, even if they won't produce or conduct research, systematic research themselves, like some external think tanks do, they will hire other consultants, they will commission research, and they will use them to develop proposals. They will use the data to come up with diagnostic. They will design plans based on what data was telling them. They will discuss that data with other stakeholders in different policy issues. So to what extent, I mean, in that sense, yes, it helped, in this case, the party to have more information, better diagnostics about what could be done. Also, they commissioned, for instance, research about the status of the staff in the state. They, for instance, they wanted to know how many people was working in the state, how many of them had contracts compared to being full-time staff. So all those elements would help the party come up with plans and ideas on what to do at the moment of getting into the power. But on the other hand, if I have to say something, for instance, in 2015, actually in the elections that think tanks, the Pensar was more active, there was a debate in Argentina, the first debate between candidates in the history of the country. And I had to say that if you would expect more from the candidate of this party in terms of, promoting a more evidence-based, evidence-informed debate. But on the other hand, the context and the characteristics of the debate in the country put a lot of pressure, and all this work was actually not very much used in that context. And with the party in power in the last 4 years, it's very difficult for me to say without an actual research to see how much those plans were used in the end. But I would say that a lot of the ministries, a lot of the political leaders that the party chose to be at the front of the ministries had a research background, have a more expert approach to the topics.
And quick question, what was the relationship between Pensar and the other think tanks in Argentina? So think tanks that were not aligned to a party, were they treated in the same way as peers, or was Pensar kind of seen as, well, you're political, we won't invite you to our events, we don't believe what you say, or there's a reason why you're saying this, or were they seen as, experts in their field, etc.?
Yes. Well, so on one hand, the Pensar will treat other external think tanks as a source of information. They will use them to produce some of the research they don't have the capacity to do, or nor the time. So, for instance, there is one of the main think tanks in Argentina is CPEC, and they will commission some study to sometimes to CPEC, but sometimes to people working at CPEC or at universities. So from my interviews, the different think tank members are also academics. Look at Pensar with positively. They thought it was a good initiative and was actually a good element and resource for a political party. I don't have a sense of what they think about specifically the research they produce, but they appreciate that some political forces were worrying about having more policy inputs.
Finally, if you were to set up, if some political party came to you and said, Leandro, let's set up a political party think tank, what would be your key recommendations? What would you try to do to make sure that this was a sustainable and positive intervention?
Yes, good question. It actually happened with other political forces in Latin America that got in contact to ask more about experience. So, well, one thing that I think was critical for this experience in Pensar was that actually the organization changed the approach to its work and become more important when they hired a person with experience in running a think tank, and that kind of change the way it shaped the work of the organization. Worried more on designing plans, coming with policy proposals. So trying to have people with experience in other research institutes was very important. I would recommend that too. Then I would recommend to define instances or spaces in which the think tank would interact with the political leaders of the party. Typically, these organizations, boards are full of political leaders of the party, but in practice, the members of the think tank don't have a lot of opportunities to work hand by hand with them. So one good thing of Pensar was that they actually the experts were shadowed by the political leader through the process of designing the government plans. So that was very, very important to have that type of connection. Another, I would say that those are the main things, but also that they legitimate the organization and as much as the organization legitimate the party. So this thing of, you know, referencing the party when they talk about policy diagnostics, when they talk about the policy issues actually makes the think tank become more relevant and started to be seen by other stakeholders like an important institution to talk to and to consider. Also, the research could help other political forces too.
Great. Well, that's I think that's it for us. Thank you very much, Leandro. That's very interesting. I hope more parties pick up this idea and develop, whether it's internal research programs or centers or external think tanks, or align themselves or connect more effectively with existing organizations that might help inform their own research. So that's it from us, and I thank you again for joining us, and thank everybody for joining online. This recording will be online in a few days, and I invite anybody who's listening into or watching it to join our newsletter and follow on Think Tanks for many more webinars this year, where we'll be discussing a range of issues from human resources to how to deal with context and the future of communications. So thank you very much again, Leandro. Thank you everybody who's joined us, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.